So yeah, this is based on this book project I've been working on, which really came out of the debate about the consequences of U.S. allies and partners acquiring nuclear weapons. On one side of the debate, you got the optimists. These are people who claim either that allies getting nuclear weapons could be good for the U.S., or at least it's not too bad, it's very manageable. And the argument I'm going to focus on tonight mainly is number 2, which is the idea that if allies and partners get nuclear weapons, they'll be able to protect themselves. We can reduce our overseas commitments, cut defense spending, and not get entangled in foreign wars, all of which would be great stuff, if true. Other side of the debate, the pessimists who think we should do more to stop any countries getting nuclear weapons, including allies. Here's some of their points. I'm not going to go through them all, but one I'm going to focus on tonight is number 3, which is the idea that if one country gets nuclear weapons, their enemies will get nuclear weapons, and then their enemies will get nuclear weapons, and everyone and their mother will get nuclear weapons, and so the U.S. has to stop that. And just to give you an idea of how convoluted this debate can be, during the campaign, President Trump seemed to take both sides of the debate, different times. So,
Go back again.
Do it too quickly. So, anyways, what struck out about this debate to me was that it was very abstract and theoretical, which made sense a few decades ago, but now we have at least 4 cases, Britain, France, Israel, and Pakistan, to weigh the merits of different arguments. So that was the project I was going to do, which actually, besides doing that, the main point was to glean lessons for potential future cases of allied proliferation. So tonight I'm going to go through the overseas commitment argument, the proliferation begets proliferation, and then end with some potential lessons for future cases. Before I get there, though, I want to make one point. I didn't actually realize this until I started, but treaty allies getting nuclear weapons impacts the U.S. a lot differently than partners like Israel and Pakistan. So during the presentation, you're going to see me treat Britain and France differently than Israel and Pakistan, and that's the reason why. So again, the argument about allied proliferation helping us reduce our overseas commitments, there's not a lot of evidence of that from any of the cases. To give you an idea, for Britain and France, here's U.S. troop levels in Europe. You see they peak in the mid-50s, go down a little bit in the 60s, stay stable for half a decade, then start declining in the 70s, and shoot back up in the 1980s. I want to be clear, I'm not saying that Britain and France's arsenals caused any of this. My basic point is that despite them having nuclear weapons, we still have a lot of troops in Europe, and we still do. And the fluctuations you do see have nothing to do with Britain and France's nuclear arsenals. So for partner cases, military aid was a better measurement, I would say. So we first gave military aid to Israel in 1959, and from then in the 8 years until they got the bomb in 1967, we gave $17 million a year to them, and then the 8 years after they got the bomb, we gave an average of nearly $700 million. And some of that was due to replenishing Israel's military stockpiles after the 67 and 73 war, but actually, unlike the Europe case, there is causation here, because around the mid-1960s, U.S. policymakers say we should start giving more, try to build up Israel's conventional capabilities to persuade it doesn't need nuclear weapons to protect itself. And then once it gets the bomb, we say we better make sure they can protect themselves with conventional weapons so they don't have to turn to using nuclear weapons. And that's really the origins of what we now call the qualitative military edge. And what I actually talked to Bob Guluchief about this. He ran the U.S.-Israel Joint Political Military Group, which kind of coordinates the alliance, and he told me that qualitative military edge was a, quote, code word for making sure that Israel could defend itself against the Arabs with conventional weapons, so it was never put in a position where it had to use nukes. So obviously nowadays, the qualitative military edge is, a lot of factors go into it, but originally it was really about Israel's nuclear arsenal and making sure it was never used. So you see military aid to Pakistan up to 1977, which is when we became really concerned about Pakistan's nuclear ambitions. We gave under $200 million. I should have memorized all these, but I didn't. Then after that, from 1977 to 1990, we gave like $272 million in aid per year. And actually, that would have been higher if you just look at the 1980s, because the late 70s, we cut off aid for a little bit. You'll notice there's no aid from 1991 to 2001, and that's because in October 1990, George H.W. Bush said he could no longer certify Pakistan did not have nuclear weapons. Under existing U.S. legislation at the time, that means he had to cut off military aid, which they really didn't want to do, but they did. And then, of course, after 9/11, it shoots back up. Like the Europe case here, there's no causation here, but my basic point is that, you know, they got nuclear weapons and then aid shot up to its highest level ever, so it obviously didn't allow us to reduce our commitments. What I find interesting, though, is not that we couldn't reduce our commitments overseas, but often these allied arsenals made it harder to achieve our objectives overseas. here's some of the way that worked for the British and French cases. The first one here is launch control, which is sort of how do you operationalize different independent nuclear arsenals within the context of a military alliance. And you see this repeatedly in the British and French case, but one example is a flexible response during the JFK and LBJ administrations. And we often think of flexible response as sort of building up our conventional forces to meet Soviet aggression at different levels of intensity. But in Europe, actually, that didn't really happen. It was mainly about how do you fight a nuclear war, or how do you use nuclear weapons without immediately escalating into nuclear Armageddon. And what McNamara and the Whiz kids really come up with is this idea of graduated controlled response, where we'd lob a few nuclear warheads at Soviet military sites but not at their cities. They'd lob a few back at us. We'd negotiate, terminate the conflict before nuclear Armageddon. And what U.S. policymakers quickly realized is that to pull off this strategy, you need centralized nuclear decision-making, which obviously NATO didn't have. So if the Soviets launched a few weapons at Britain, for instance, and Britain responded with all their arsenals, there was no way to terminate the conflict. And actually, initially, JFK administration talks about putting Britain out of the nuclear business. That didn't go very far. So the Allied arsenals was what prevented this strategy from really coming forward. And I want to be clear, I'm not defending flexible response. I think it was kind of a wacky strategy. It ignored the fog of war and part of Clausewitz's Trinity. But the lesson I take away is that, in the future what I take away is that U.S. policymakers couldn't adopt a defense strategy that they felt best suited our needs at that time. And even if we don't like flexible response, there's nothing to say that in the future, defense strategies we do like against, say, China or something wouldn't be inhibited because of Allied arsenals. So number 2 is France leaving NATO command. Basically, France gets a operational nuclear deterrent in 1966, and de Gaulle announces that France is going to leave NATO command and kick all U.S. and NATO forces out of French territory. Now, nuclear weapons didn't cause him to do this. He had his own views about allies and sovereignty that predated nuclear weapons. What it did do was made it more secure enough to act on those ambitions. And you might think that's a great news because it doesn't seem like Charles de Gaulle is going to rule future nuclear Japan or nuclear South Korea or nuclear Turkey, so we shouldn't have to worry about this. That's not the lesson I take away. The lesson I take away is we can't control who's going to be in charge of allied countries in the future. And what's interesting about this is, although we often associate France's nuclear program with Charles de Gaulle, the main decisions and progress on the nuclear weapons was made by the Fourth Republic when de Gaulle was out of power. And Fourth Republic leaders viewed French nuclear arsenals similar to their British counterparts in that they thought it would increase France's influence within NATO and with the Americans, but it ultimately be part of NATO in some fashion or another. And then, of course, de Gaulle comes to power and uses it to destroy the alliance or to seriously impact the alliance. So in the future, even if a foreign leader that supports the U.S. alliance initiates a nuclear program, there's no guarantee that their successors won't use it to destroy that alliance in a way they oppose. And finally, and I think most interesting, is conventional military cuts. As a regional hegemon with interests across Eurasia, I think the ideal situation for the U.S. is providing the bulk of the naval and air power and having our forward deployed allies provide most of the manpower. The Soviet Union in World War II was great in that regard, not so much in others. But since World War II, we've tried to get our allies consistently to spend more on their defense, and it's often been unsuccessful. And part of the reason it was unsuccessful in the French and the British cases is because once they got nuclear weapons, they decided we don't need to spend as much on defense, and we also don't need a large military. And actually, Frank showed me an article from the New York Times a few days ago that shows the same thing still going on. So here's some charts just to demonstrate this. UK defense spending, the percentage of GDP goes down after they get the nuclear weapons. Size of the U.S. armed force or UK armed forces really goes down once they get nuclear weapons. And same thing with the French cases, decline in defense spending as a percentage of GDP. And then definitely with French military personnel, when they get the bomb, they have about 1 million men under arms. That declines by 50% over the next few years. And roughly 90% of those cuts were to the army because the army didn't have a role in the nuclear arsenal. And also French army spending as percentage of total defense spending also declines. Now, if some of these reductions would have taken place regardless, they were getting rid of their empires, they were getting out of Algiers, whatever, but it gets cut more. Defense spending and the size of their armed forces gets cut much more steeply because they have nuclear weapons. And they're very explicit about this. The British publish defense white papers in 1952 and 1957 that says, we have nuclear weapons now, let's reduce our forces. We don't need big armies in the era of nuclear warfare. And you saw the French generals make the same case that they could save a lot of money by building nukes because they wouldn't have to have large conventional forces. Israel and Pakistan's arsenals also complicate America's ability to achieve its objectives overseas. I'm not going to go through all these because I don't want to put everyone to sleep here, but I will focus the last two ones. The first is that the nuclearization of the Indo-Pakistani dispute really makes it a lot bigger interest for the United States than would otherwise be the case. You know, those countries fight 2 wars or 3 wars before they get nuclear weapons, and it's not that the U.S. is disinterested in it, but it's not like a huge major security threat to the U.S. And then once they get nuclear weapons, the U.S. is forced to treat every crisis between them as a major national security threat because of its potential to escalate into nuclear warfare, and we start sending high-level emissaries there to mediate it. And that's the opposite of what the optimists would say would happen when allies get nuclear weapons. And then the last one is Pakistan too big to fail. I actually had the pleasure for the Pakistan case of interviewing 25 to 30 former U.S. policymakers who worked on Pakistan from every administration from Ford to Obama, including Donald Camp back there, thank you. And I asked almost all of them, do you think that Pakistan having nuclear weapons makes it more important to the U.S. than it would be because of other factors like geography or the size of its economy? And basically everyone said yes, 100%. And it's almost like North Korea in that regard. Like, North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons. Would it be such a big preoccupation in U.S. foreign policy? I think the answer is no. And same with Pakistan. So again, that's the opposite of what the optimists would expect. So then the notion that if one country gets the bomb, their enemy will get the bomb, their enemies will get the bomb. You don't see any evidence of this from the 4 cases either. No one got nuclear weapons because Britain did, or because France did, or because Israel did, or Pakistan did. But what's interesting is allied proliferation contributes to the spread of nuclear weapons in another way, and that's that these countries start selling the nuclear technology to friendly countries who then use it to build nuclear weapons. And I call this nuclear children because I haven't thought of a better phrase, and I really would appreciate your help if anyone can think of a better one to call it. But the French case, the biggest example of this, of course, is France sells Israel everything it needs to build nuclear weapons, a reactor or a processing plant. France also tries to sell Pakistan and South Korea, and to a lesser extent Taiwan, reprocessing plants. The U.S. blocks those deals, and then France does sell Japan reprocessing capabilities, which have not been used to make nuclear weapons yet, but could be. Also, France is trying to sell China this now, too. Israel's not quite as bad in that regard, but there is pretty strong evidence that at one point Israel offered apartheid South Africa Jericho missiles with nuclear warheads attached, so full nuclear arsenal. Apartheid South Africa said no to that deal, but later on Israel helps it build its own Jericho 2 missiles, which it used South Africa used with the bombs it did make itself. Also sold at tritium. The worst case from the U.S. perspective, though, of course, is Pakistan, where France sold nuclear technology to U.S. friends. Pakistan seemed to adopt the mantra that the enemy of my friend is also my friend, and so sells the reprocessing or the enrichment capabilities to Iran, to North Korea, to Libya, and also after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, there was some Pakistani agents that tried to sell Iraqis nuclear bomb designs to help it build a bomb real quickly before the first Gulf War started to deter the U.S. kicking them out of Kuwait. That deal thankfully didn't go through, but in any case, so you do see the beginning proliferation doesn't happen in the way that the pessimists seem to think it will, but it does happen. So again, I'm going to close out with some potential lessons for future cases. I just picked South Korea because it is a stand-in for allies. It could easily be Japan or Turkey or whoever you want. Launch control issues I mentioned. I think you're already seeing U.S. launch control issues in the U.S. ROC alliance. I'm old enough to remember that before Trump fell in love with Kim Jong-un, he was threatening to attack North Korea all the time, and President Moon actually got up and said, you can't attack North Korea without Seoul's approval. And then less talked about, I think you see South Korea acquiring the capabilities to carry out risky offensive strategies like decapitation strikes and preemptive strikes on North Korea's nuclear and missile sites. And obviously, any North Korea retaliation for those strikes would hit at least the 28,000 troops the U.S. has in South Korea, probably U.S. troops in Japan, and potentially the U.S. homeland. So the question becomes, what say does the U.S. have in greenlighting those attacks? And so far, South Korea has said none. So you're already seeing these launch control issues in the U.S. ROC alliance. I think if you put nuclear weapons into that, instead of using conventional warheads to attack North Korea, they were using nuclear ones. That would obviously be a way bigger issue. Conventional cuts, I actually think the conventional cuts would be a bigger deal with Japan and Turkey. Think about Japan, instead of spending money on attack submarines and destroyers, it was spending money on nuclear weapons. That would obviously reduce our capabilities in the Asia Pacific. But even with South Korea, Like I said, we got a little over 28,000 troops in South Korea. South Korea is, I think, 464,000 men under arms, men and women. So if they got nuclear weapons, decide they no longer need a large military force to deter North Korea, that they would reduce that force, and it could impact the U.S. Most interesting, though, is what would happen if South Korea followed de Gaulle's model and kicked the U.S. out of the country. And well, when France did that, it created a major immediate headache for the U.S. officials. It took place within the context of a multilateral alliance, so ultimately we could just move our forces to Belgium and other European NATO countries. We obviously don't have that a multilateral system in place in Asia. We got the hub and spoke system, so if South Korea or Japan kicked us out, who would take us in basically? And obviously, with precision-guided missiles today, we want to make our forces more dispersed, not more concentrated, so that would be a big issue. And lessons for Saudi Arabia. Again, Saudi Arabia is kind of a stand-in for partner nations. Just as the nuclearization of the Indo-Pakistani dispute made it a way bigger concern for the U.S., think about if the Iran-Saudi Arabia proxy war was taking place under the nuclear shadow, how much more concerned the U.S. would have to be that events in Yemen or Syria could end up causing a nuclear war. The loose nukes issue I didn't really discuss. Relates to Pakistan. I think most people here know it. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is not the terrorist safe haven that Pakistan is. I don't think any country really is, frankly. But if Saudi Arabia got the bomb, I think we'd be worried about insider threats, certainly, some about terrorism, and then, of course, how certain are we that the Saudi regime is going to be there? The Saudi regime is going to be there in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. If not, what does the transition look like, and what does the successor regime look like? Is it something like the Shah in the Islamic Republic? I don't think we could rule that out, which would obviously be a major concern. And then arms control. It's really interesting that Israel's nuclear arsenal complicates America's international arms control in a lot of different ways. I didn't discuss this. Just for a quick example, when we we're pursuing the fissile material cutoff in the 1990s, Bibi Netanyahu goes to Clinton and says, this is a concern to us. We don't want this to impact us. And since then, every U.S. president has signed a pledge to the Israelis that any arms control we pursue won't impact the Israelis. So with Saudi Arabia, I think you're already starting to see this a little bit in that we signed arms control or a civil nuclear cooperation agreement with the UAE that said that they could not reprocess or enrich. But one clause in that says that if a different country in the region gets a more favorable 1-2-3 agreement, then the UAE can revisit their own 1-2-3 agreement. And of course, now Saudi Arabia is pushing for a 1-2-3 agreement that does not contain the gold standard, which could screw things up with the UAE. And then one of the weaknesses of these 4 cases is also that either they got nuclear weapons before the NPT happened, or they never joined the NPT. And obviously, today's day and age, that's different. So the countries that got nuclear weapons would most likely have to leave the NPT. How does that impact it? So I think that would be a big concern that you didn't necessarily see in these cases, but would be in the future. And that is it.